This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
The Science Notes podcast on OAR FM Dunedin, brought to you by the Division of Sciences at the University of Otago. I'm Dave McMorrin. Over the next half hour, I'll be chatting with a graduate science student about their research, their passion for science, and the things that fuel their creativity. Well, hello there and welcome to Science Notes again for another episode. My name is Dave McMorrin, and this time our guest is Ashlee Berryman. Hello, Ashlee.
Kia ora, thanks for having me on.
Ashlee, now you have to remind me, you're doing a PhD.
Correct.
In which department?
The Department of Psychology.
In psychology, that's right. Yes, even though on paper your project doesn't seem necessarily psychological.
No, I'm technically neuroscience, but situated within the Department of Psychology.
Right,
yeah.
Very good. I first heard Ashlee, well, if I'm honest, at the 3-minute thesis competition last year, talking about her research, and then various things got in the way. But then I listened to you again a few weeks ago, and now here you are to tell us about what you're up to. You're doing neuroscience,
yeah,
and in particular, you're doing neuroscience in relationship to endometriosis.
Correct, yeah. So I consider myself a cognitive neuroscientist by trade, but my particular passion lies in women's cognitive health.
Right.
So I'm quite interested in gynecological conditions. So when there's a component between cognitive disruption and pain, that's my area of expertise and an area that I quite like to delve into to see how we can help these people to flourish again. And I hope that it has implications beyond just the condition that I'm looking at the moment. That's where my passion lies, really. Yeah.
And presumably, inevitably, a very underexplored area.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yes.
An alarmingly underexplored area, yes.
So how is it that you find yourself doing a PhD in this?
So my background is in psychology. I did both my bachelor's and honours degree in psychology.
Here?
Yes, both at Otago.
Right. Yep.
And I'd always wanted to work in some area of women's health. Initially, I'd wanted to go down the route of becoming a general practitioner and then somewhat specialising after the fact. But it kind of just fell into place that after my honours year, I fell in love with research.
Yeah, that can happen.
It does.
Yeah.
And I sort of just had to weigh up my options. I put in the application to do a PhD and had planned to apply to med school that year as well through the postgraduate route, but got offered a fantastic scholarship that I just couldn't turn down and thought, hey, I'm still going to be a doctor and I'm going to be helping people even sooner by putting out those publications earlier on, as opposed to waiting 6 years down the track. And who knows what the future will hold? But
that's right. I mean, you can always do medicine, but you can't always necessarily get the PhD scholarship. And like I'm always saying to the first year students who I see who do health science first year, that there's multiple ways that you can get a career involved with helping people. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be a GP or a surgeon.
100% correct, yeah.
So, endometriosis. Tell us what it is. I mean, I'm sure most people have heard of it, but maybe it's one of these things that unless you actually have had personal experience of it, you don't necessarily know what it is.
Yeah. Which is very surprising. So it's a gynecological health condition, and it's characterised by cells similar to the lining of the uterus, so the inside of the womb, growing outside of the uterus where they aren't normally supposed to be. And so these cells, they're called endothelial cells, can come together to create what we call endometriomas. So those are clusters of these cells that can be identified through surgery as endometriosis. It affects around about 10% of people, but in actual fact it's thought to be a lot higher than that number because those statistics come from people who have obviously only been able to receive a diagnosis. There's a lot of countries and communities that's just not an option.
Yeah.
And then, again, from that statistic is only from surgically or histology-based reports. So,
yeah, this was something that was in the notes that you sent me that again, in part I was surprised about, but in part I thought, I shouldn't be surprised about. The only way that you can officially say I have endometriosis is from some sort of surgical process. Yeah.
The most common way is to undergo a laparoscopy. So that's like a keyhole surgery that you'd have in the abdomen or pelvis, where they actually go into your uterus and sometimes explore gastric organs as well to see if they can identify any of those cells. But people can still receive a diagnosis from their general practitioner. We generally call that suspected endometriosis, or you can have a vaginal ultrasound as well. But that doesn't meet the statistics requirements that we'd see on Stats NZ to say this amount of people have endometriosis in New Zealand. Yeah.
And what's the treatment for it currently?
Good question.
I mean, it's one thing to wait and then get the actual a proper diagnosis. But
so, ironically, that surgery, the laparoscopy, is often used to first and foremost diagnose officially in a clinical setting. And then while they're in there, sometimes they'll do what we call ablation of those endothelial cells. So they'll essentially remove them while they're in there, but that's not always the case, especially if a patient hasn't been able to give consent to do that prior to going in, if they're just doing it exploratory.
Yep.
And perhaps even worse off is in a lot of cases, people are going in for that laparoscopy not knowing that it's endometriosis that they're suspecting to have looked at. It might be similar symptoms or sister conditions, if you will.
Yep.
So unless they can get back in through more than likely private referral, because the wait list's just absolutely ridiculous, your options are forms of hormonal birth control or hormonal replacement therapies and opioid medications to manage the pain.
Yep.
Which is quite shocking in my opinion.
Yep. Opioids are not necessarily the best first solution.
They've got a whole myriad of their own problems.
Yeah. Do we know what causes it?
There are several theories, lots of them situated around retrograde menstruation. Some think that there is a link to in utero, and others think it's caused by a bacteria. I forget the name, but I think it's called Fusobacterium. Look, there's no definitive known cause of it, but there are a growing number of highly considered risk factors associated, like early menarche. So the earlier a girl has her first period, the higher the risk.
Right.
Low birth weight is another factor.
Yeah. And given that the stats aren't all that they could be, is it something that's getting more prevalent?
As in terms of the percentage of people we're recognising with the condition? Yeah, definitely. And it's like a lot of things. Look, I don't know how to word it perfectly, but frankly, it annoys me when I see sort of online, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, people going, "Oh, we never had this back in my day. You took a Panadol and got over it. It was just called a heavy period," or whatever.
Yep.
But it's like most things in life, if we didn't have a name for it and we didn't know that you could go in and explore for it, obviously there were people who were living with it. We just didn't know about it.
Yes. Back in the good old days when life expectancy was less and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, but back when we were dying from tuberculosis.
Correct. Yes. Yes. So, how then does a neuroscientist get involved in this sort of research?
Good question. No, fantastic question, actually, because when people think of gynecological conditions characterised by pain and heavy bleeding, you wouldn't necessarily make that connection. But like most chronic pain conditions, which is a big component of this condition, endometriosis, these people have been reporting cognitive complaints. So they've been having difficulties at work, disruptions to their studies. Quite often people have what they term endobrain, so just that chronic brain fog, staying at home, feeling like they're not flourishing pretty much. They're not performing at their best. And so when I came into my PhD, I started with a systematic review, which is where we synthesise everything that is known about a given topic, which surprisingly was bugger all in this case. Long story short, these people were also making complaints of these cognitive disruptions. But in a clinical sense, we have to have objective measures of these cognitive difficulties before we're able to do anything about it. So that was the first step of my PhD, was to be able to actually characterise in a lab-based setting using your validated computerised
We're
tasks.
Scientists, we want to put numbers on
Exactly,
things.
yeah. But and hey, anecdotally, we know this problem exists. I've seen it firsthand in people I've had in my lab and friends. But I can't do anything about it in terms of interventions to fix the problem without first proving at a scientific level, hey, there actually is a validated problem here that we can measure using this battery of tasks in a computer.
Yep. Because if you can't do that, then you can't say that what you've done is actually better or fixing anything. Exactly. If you don't know what it is, you can't say I fixed it.
We need something to restore a baseline measure.
Yeah. So what is it then that you're doing for your research? I mean, you've done the survey. You've found that there's clearly a need for the survey, for the research.
So I've got 2 experiments that have looked comprehensively at cognitive functioning in general. So that involves a series of cognitive tasks that tap into a range of different domains. So these are things that we do in our everyday life. So we've got measures assessing basic visual-motor performance, inhibitory control, mental flexibility, and a range of working memory paradigms. And from those studies, we identified that there are significant measurable deficits in people who had endometriosis. And this occurred to a greater extent among those who had chronic pelvic pain as opposed to those who have endometriosis without that chronic pain component.
Right.
And importantly, in this first study, pain factors, including pain session, pain over the last 6 months, and cognitive intrusion due to pain, so how much pain's occupying one's mind, emerged as significant drivers of those cognitive disruptions, meaning that it's not terrible news that we've found these cognitive deficits. I like to think of it as we've finally validated the lived experiences of people living with the condition, and have somewhere to move forward from here, knowing that pain is emerging as a potential target for an interventional study, meaning that hopefully if we fix that pain or at least bring it down a notch, that their cognition should restore or come back up to mimicking those levels of a healthy control woman.
But like you say, just being able to say to the people, yes, there is actually something going on and this is why you're having trouble focusing at work or whatever.
I like to say it's not all in your head. It is in your head.
Yeah. How do you get your test subjects?
Recruitment, it's been a little bit different across the studies, but mainly utilising the University of Otago student pool. So people have been really great at coming forth. They receive either money or course credit as reimbursement, but a lot of them are just very, very keen to finally have someone researching a condition that they have that no one else has seemed to be looking at least to them. They don't see it popping up much across the universities. Otherwise, we've used referral from the obstetrics and gynecology department here at Dunedin Hospital, and otherwise it's been online advertisements.
Right.
Thankfully, a lot of endometriosis pages have been brilliant at getting on board with sharing it.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you've got lots of data points, as it were.
Yeah. I wouldn't say lots. It's still been hard.
You got sufficient.
Yeah. I've reached power, if that means anything.
Because that's often the problem. We've had other people doing not endometriosis, but these sorts of studies on the show in the past. And oftentimes, one of the big problems is just getting people to be involved in the study.
No, I'd definitely say that's been one of the biggest limitations, and I can completely understand it too. If someone's said, hey, look, this is amazing work and I'm keen to be a part of it, and then they have a flare-up, they're sitting at home in 10 out of 10 pain and trying not to be sick, I totally get they're not up to
Ideally,
coming
you'd
in.
have them in the lab studying them into that condition, but that's not really what they want to do.
Yeah, it's not feasible.
Yeah. So that's part of it then?
That's part of it, correct. So during those cognitive testing batteries, across 2 studies, I've also had simultaneous neuroimaging. So the main one I'm working with is electroencephalography, or EEG. And I've been looking at a particular biomarker in the brain across different scalp sites called the P300. So this is an event-related potential, meaning that when a stimulus, be that visual or auditory, appears on the screen while these people are completing the tasks, it actually produces a spike in the brain that I'm able to measure and see on a computer screen next to them while they're completing these tasks. And so if we compare that spike to someone who is healthy and not in any pain, we can see whether or not in the first place there are differences, and then whether or not we think that might be influencing their performance on the tasks as well.
Right.
And so that's been quite fruitful. In the first instance, I established that, yes, there are differences. And there had been a prior study that had looked at that in people with endometriosis as well. But I think a key novel component of my experimental paradigm with it was that we incorporated a group of women who had endometriosis without that chronic pain component. And so surprisingly, we found in that group that they also showed a smaller amount of activity with regards to that event-related potential I'm interested in, which points to the fact that perhaps pain isn't the only contributing factor here. And so with some other fancy analyses, we were able to identify that a lot of affective symptomatology was also contributing to that, meaning if people had higher depression or anxiety scores based on questionnaires, they also appeared to have a smaller, what we call amplitude, so less activity in those brain regions that are usually used to be able to perform optimally on a task. So there is definitely a connection there. My study at the moment, which is the last one in my PhD, is sort of revisiting that event-related potential in hopes to identify where whereabouts in the brain this aberration, this abnormality is actually coming from. It's all well and good to go, hey, cool, this group of people have less brain activity and it's probably associated with the fact they're not performing as well on these tasks. Where is it coming from? So that if we want to do central nervous system or brain stimulation techniques to boost their cognition or simultaneously alleviate their pain, we have to know where it's coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This might be a stupid question, but if there's something happening in their brain when they have endometriosis, is the thing that's happening in their brain just because the endometriosis is causing the pain, or is there some sort of physiological relationship between the two things? Like is it because they have endometriosis rather than as a result of having endometriosis?
Yeah, it is a very complex question. One that I'm trying to tackle in the background by combining the data from all 3 experimental studies together. Look, it's tricky. You've got the pain component. So as we know, when we're in pain, you might not be able to concentrate as well because the pain's occupying your mind. We think of that on the psychological level. We then have these endometriomas, let's say for argument's sake, they're growing on the bowel, which is a common site for them. Some of these cell clusters are able to form their own connections to the central nervous system, meaning that they have their own direct pain fibres that are transmitting to the brain. And so even if we can somehow downplay the psychological processes associated with it, pain signals are being
there's still a
actively
physiological
fired.
thing there.
So you've got that.
Right.
And then this is sort of taking a step backwards away from neuroscience, but looking at it from more of a biopsychology lens. There have been well-established bidirect reciprocal relationships between pain experiences, cognitive functioning, affective conditions, rumination, central sensitization. It's just this big map of all this amplification of bad things we don't want, amplification of pain signals, interpreting that pain higher, having a lower pain threshold, downstream effects on cognition. It's so hard.
Yep. So it's from a experimental point of view, where you ideally want to try and isolate a thing, a cause and effect.
Yes.
It becomes, it's more interesting, it's more important, but it's more difficult to do that. Is there, you said the P300, that the spike that you're looking for in the brain. Why that one? And is it because that's been found to be related to other, like migraines or something? Is there other research on other conditions that has overlap with what you're finding?
Yeah, a substantial amount. So what's of more relevance to me is looking to other pain conditions that might be analogous with endometriosis, which was my starting point. That this P300 biomarker can be split into several subcomponents, but just more generally, typically reflects cognitive processes. It reflects how much evaluation's going into a task.
Right.
It can tell us the delay between a stimuli appearing and a person having to make a response to it. So that has implications for outside of like a computerized lab setting, if you think about completing mental arithmetic or whatever.
Or driving.
Driving, exactly. Avoiding collisions.
Yes.
So a very, very well-established measure of cognitive efficiency, and we think typically the bigger the spike of that amplitude, the bigger this neural activity we're measuring, generally the more efficient someone's cognitive functioning is.
Right.
But again, we tap into complexity when we look into different parts of the brain. In one regard, if we see this drop over cognitive regions, then we can make very clear inferences that that's going to have some sort of implication on their cognitive performance, especially if we have that simultaneous data. In other regards, we can see a bigger spike if we're looking just over pain processing regions, which makes sense if you think about it. If someone's in higher pain, they're going to have a bigger spike over that pain region as opposed to the more frontal parts of the brain that are needed to complete those cognitive tasks. But this has been well established in conditions like fibromyalgia, migraine, as you say, pelvic inflammatory disease, dysmenorrhea, which is formal menstrual-related pain, lower back pain, and the list just goes on.
Yeah.
And there had been one study, to my awareness, that had looked at it in endometriosis, but as I alluded to earlier, this group was a fairly small sample size, so again, we want to replicate it in a bigger cohort, but they only looked at it in chronic pelvic pain, and that's, I think, somewhat neglecting a large still majority of people who do have endometriosis without chronic pelvic pain. And that's not to say these people don't experience pain. It just means that it's typically more cyclical, perhaps amplifying during menstruation or ovulation.
And possibly not ever diagnosed.
Exactly. We've got to account for a lot of people who have endometriosis but are considered asymptomatic when it comes to not experiencing that debilitating pelvic pain. They still have other conditions and other negative symptoms impacting their life.
But then they're just taking Panadol and getting on with it, apparently. So, how far through the PhD are you now?
I have 5 months left
to
the finish line.
Right, so we're well into writing everything up. And
we're locked in.
So do we have conclusions from the research that are going to be useful going forward?
Definitely. I don't have conclusions from the final study yet. That's localisation of where these brain abnormalities are coming from. That's the last big haul right up at the moment. But from those earlier studies, long story short, we've finally objectively identified those cognitive deficits, highlighted that pain factors are emerging as significant mediators and moderators of those outcomes for people with endo. And this replicated in a cohort of people, a separate group with no overlap from the previous study, which positions us quite nicely to do some type of intervention, whether that be central nervous system or peripherally, so through something like skin vibrations to play that pain.
We can do something a little bit more sophisticated than just opioids.
Yes, I'm trying to. People get a little bit iffy when I talk about brain stimulation techniques, but these are something that are actually quite common. People wear these devices at home. You can get them in the form of a headband.
Yep.
So
again, if you not have a reason to be personally involved, you don't know that all the stuff is there.
Exactly.
But yes.
So it can sound a little bit funny, but my next steps from here are to run some type of interventional study that is targeting the pain and using that pain reduction, leveraging it to see if it's going to have cognitive benefits.
Yep.
The extent of them is unknown yet, but hey, even if I'm just finding a way to effectively manage pain and potentially improve their well-being scores without people relying on tramadol, long-term paracetamol use,
which themselves aren't necessarily good for being able to work effectively. Yeah.
That's where I'm situated at the
Cool.
moment.
And then after this, after you've finished the PhD,
fingers crossed for postdoc funding. So that we're currently pitching an idea to use one of these wearable brain stimulation devices that target mood and pain parts of the brain to restore cognition, and we'll test them at multiple time points to see if it's going to improve their cognitive functioning. Cool. And if it provides fruitful, it's going to position these at-home wearable devices as a meaningful alternative to having to rely on prescription medications for a long time, at least for the pain aspects of the condition.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming and talking to us about it, and all the best for whatever's next. It only seems like good, useful, important things.
I'm hoping to. I really, the ultimate goal of all of this together is just to improve the lives of these women who are fed up with the healthcare system.
In this aspect of it, at least.
Yes.
Indeed. Okay, thanks again, and thank you everyone out there for listening. You've been listening to the Science Notes podcast, brought to you by the Division of Sciences at the University of Otago. To listen again, or to find other episodes in this series, go to Otago Access Radio's website, oar.org.nz, or to your favourite podcast platform.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.